Hi, I'm Heather Marie Montilla, and you are watching PBS Books. Thank you for joining us. PBS Books, in collaboration with Maryland Public Television, is pleased to host today's conversation with award-winning author Clint Smith in celebration of the 2020 Library of Congress National Book Festival. PBS Books is proud to partner with the Library of Congress to promote the 2022 National Book Festival. Let's take a moment to hear from the Librarian of Congress, Dr. Carla Hayden.
Books bring us together as the Library of Congress National Book Festival returns in person on September 3rd at the Washington Convention Center. The festival is free for readers of all ages. We will also be live streaming 3 stages for audiences across the country. Featured authors this year include Janelle Monáe, Leslie Jordan, Niall DeMarco, Nick Offerman, Angie Thomas, and more. So go to loc.gov/bookfest for more.
If you live in Maryland or in the DMV, don't miss the 2022 Library of Congress National Book Festival on Saturday, September 3rd from 9 a.m. to 8 p.m. The festival is free and open to everyone. The complete schedule for the 2022 Library of Congress National Book Festival can be found at loc.gov/bookfest. But if you can't be there in person, you can live stream it and curate your own experience from the comfort of your home. Now, through August 31st, PBS Books and PBS stations will host a series of 10 virtual events with 11 authors. They will also be available on demand on PBS Books and the National Book Festival website. Today's conversation focuses on Clint Smith to discuss his work and his involvement in the festival. His work, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America, is a deeply researched and transporting exploration of the legacy of slavery and its imprint on centuries of American history. It illustrates how some of our country's most essential stories are hidden in plain view. Well, like in every program, today we would like to thank our library partners, more than 1,800 strong across the country, as well as numerous PBS stations for joining us. But most importantly, we'd like to thank you for being here and participating in this very important conversation. Well, now the moment you've been waiting for. It is my extraordinary pleasure to introduce Clint Smith. Clint Smith is a staff writer at The Atlantic. He is the author, as mentioned, of the best-selling narrative nonfiction book, How the Word is Passed, A Reckoning with the History of Slavery Across America. He is also the author of the collection of poetry, Counting Descent. The book won the 2017 Literary Award for Best Poetry Book and from the Black Caucus of the ALA, the American Library Association, and was a finalist for an NAACP Image Award. He has received numerous fellowships from New America, the Emerson Collective, the Art of Justice, Cavcanum, and the National Science Foundation. Born and raised in New Orleans, he received his bachelor's degree in English from Davidson College, his doctorate in education from Harvard University. Welcome, Clint.
Thank you so much for having me. It's good to be here.
So glad to have you. Well, to moderate today's conversation, we're pleased to have Stephen Henderson. Stephen Henderson is the current host of American Black Journal, WDET's Detroit Today, founding editor of Bridge Detroit, and former Pulitzer Prize winning editorial page editor of the Detroit Free Press. A Detroit native, Henderson is a graduate of the University of Detroit Jesuit High School and the University of Michigan. He has worked previously as a reporter, editorial writer, and editor of the Baltimore Sun, the Chicago Tribune, and the Knight Ridder Washington Bureau, where he covered the Supreme Court from 2003 to 2007. Henderson's work has been honored with more than a dozen national awards, including for work that is published in the book Best Newspaper Writing 2001. Henderson connects to readers and viewers with perspective and passion. You can follow him on Twitter at SH Detroit. Welcome, Stephen.
Hey, great to be here.
We're so glad to have you. We knew that you would be wonderful for this conversation when we reached out to you and you said, Clint Smith, he's a great person to talk to. I've spoken to him before. So Thank you for agreeing to do this and for hosting the conversation. I'll let you get right into it. Enjoy.
Yeah. Thanks very much. I first want to say how excited I am to be doing this as part of the book festival, the National Archives Book Festival, and you've got Carla Hayden as the person who's putting this on, and I would be remiss if I didn't sing her praises a bit. I lived in Baltimore, as you said in my bio, for about a decade, and Carla ran the libraries there, the Enoch Pratt libraries for us in Baltimore. Her love of words and books and the ideas that come out of books and literature is just absolutely wonderful, and it is contagious. And I can't think of somebody better to be heading this up. So I'm really glad to be here because of that. But I'm also glad to be here because Clint Smith's book is one of my favorites over the last year or so. And he and I have talked about it before on the radio show I host on WDET in Detroit. So Clint, good to see you again.
Good to see you again too.
Yeah. So I actually want to start not at the beginning of your book, but on the third chapter, because I think there is something about that chapter and the place that it centers on that is really different from other places in America, and that's Angola Prison in Louisiana. There are lots of places that you chronicle in this book that are familiar to people. There are some that are unfamiliar. There are some where the connection to our horrible history of slavery in this country is pretty obvious, in some places where it's not. But I think there's maybe no place more appropriate to talk about in this book than Angola, of course, which is the largest prison in America, but it also was one of the largest plantations in America when slavery was legal. And so I want to talk about Angola, the role it plays in our history, but then, of course, how it perfectly sets up, I think, the narrative you are trying to work with in this book, which is to remind us that slavery is not a thing of the past. It's not a memory in the United States. It's something that's all around us, and our lives in this country continue to be shaped by the institutions that propped up slavery, and of course the places where those institutions grew. So let's first talk about what Angola is and why you included it.
Yeah, so for this book, I went to a range of different places: plantations, memorials, monuments, museums, neighborhoods, houses, and prisons. And Angola felt particularly important to go to, in part because I'm from New Orleans, I'm from Louisiana, and so the sort of horror of Angola sort of hung over my childhood like a cloud in some ways. It was this sort of omnipresent force of evil and banality, but I had never been there. And so, for some context for folks, Angola is, as you said, the largest maximum security prison in the country. It is 18,000 acres wide, bigger than the island of Manhattan. It's a place where 75% of the people held there are Black men. Over 70% of them are serving life sentences. And it's built on top of a former plantation. And what I always tell people is that if you were to go to Germany, you have the largest maximum security prison in Germany. And it was built on top of a former concentration camp, in which the people held there were disproportionately Jewish. That place would quite rightfully be a global emblem of anti-Semitism. It would be abhorrent. It would be disgusting. We would never allow a place like that to exist because it would so clearly run counter to all of our moral and ethical sensibilities. I was in Berlin a few months ago, and I was visiting the Sachsenhausen concentration camp outside of East Berlin. And I was standing there, and I was standing on this sort of vast expanse of gray, empty, haunting land. This place that had once been the site upon which Jewish people and other forces who were pushing against the Holocaust or pushing against the Nazis, or who the Nazis decided to persecute, where they were held and killed. And I was standing on this land, and I was just imagining what it would be like if on that land, if there was a prison that was built, and on top of that prison, or within that prison, the vast majority of the people held there were Jewish. It was so, I couldn't even finish the thought exercise because it was so viscerally upsetting. It was so absurd to imagine that we would ever allow that to happen, because we would never, appropriately so. But then I go back to my time standing at Angola. I think, what does it mean that in the largest maximum security prison in the country, where the vast majority of people are Black men serving life sentences, many who were sentenced as children, where the United States is the only country in the world that sentences children to life without parole, many of whom were sentenced by non-unanimous juries. The United States is a place where there are only two states, only one state now, where non-unanimous juries are legal, and they were recently outlawed by the Supreme Court for being an explicit vestige of white supremacy. And so, given all of that, what does it mean that history, given the history of that land, that such a manifestation would be present there? And I think too about the gift shop that exists at Angola. The gift shop it sits at the front of the prison. And I remember the first time I went in there, there are coffee mugs and shot glasses and baseball caps and hoodies and all sort of prison paraphernalia, stuffed animals dressed in prison garb. And on one of the coffee mugs, it has the silhouette of a watchtower. And above and below the watchtower, it reads, Angola, a gated community. As if to make a mockery of or belittle the experiences of the thousands of people who have been incarcerated there, the tens of thousands of people who have been incarcerated there over the course of generations. And I think about, similarly, a conversation I had with a guy named Norris Henderson. And Norris was incarcerated in Angola for almost 30 years, got out in 2003, and is at the forefront of a lot of prison reform work happening in Louisiana. We were leaving our tour. We were on this bus, and Norris is looking at his hands, and he's looking out of the window, and he sees these men who are working in the fields, and they're lifting their garden hose into the air and digging them into the earth, lifting their shovels into the air and digging them into the earth, lifting their spades in the air and digging them into the earth. He keeps looking at his hands. He looks at the men. He looks at his hands. He looks at the men. And his hands are filled with these calluses from all these years he spent working in the fields of Angola himself. And he's like, Clint, I can't tell you what it feels like. I can't express to you what it feels like to work in a field, picking cotton for 7 cents an hour, and wondering if my own ancestors have been picking cotton in that same field 200 years ago. So for the folks who've been incarcerated at Angola, this history is not an intellectual exercise. It's not an abstraction. This is in their body. It's in their bones. It's in their blood. It's in their hands. And so, I could have written a whole book just about my experience at Angola, but it felt important to include Angola because it is a sort of contemporary manifestation of the residue that continues from the history of slavery in a very direct and unsettling way.
Yeah. When you think about prisons and the prison population, the carceral state in this country, I mean, we have been talking in recent years about its connection to slavery, its roots in the 13th Amendment, which made slavery unconstitutional, except for in cases of incarceration. I once had a conversation with the historian Doris Kearns Goodwin about places that are so rich with this kind of history. And she talked about the way that if you go there and stand and just let yourself be in the place, the things that you'll feel and the things that you might even hear call on the history of that place, that these are not dead places in the sense of their past being buried. They're places where that is something you can feel just by being there. And I've been to Angola as a former court reporter, and you do, the hair stands up just a little on your arms, I think, and on the back of your neck when you're there. I wonder if you can talk about what you felt as somebody who grew up in Louisiana, finally seeing that place.
It's a strange and haunting place, and I fully agree with Doris in her assessment. I think that part of the reason that the sort of central conceit of this project is the idea that I'm going to travel from place to place and put my body in the place where it happens, is that it becomes, as Doris alluded to, a much more sort of dynamic and multi-sensory experience when you are putting your body on the land, when you are standing in the room, where you are putting your feet in the soil, when you smell the things, when you see the way light strikes certain items. I always remember standing in a slave cabin at the Whitney Plantation. The Whitney Plantation is not too far from Angola. Oftentimes Norris brings people to the Whitney and then to Angola to put the two places in conversation with one another. And the Whitney is incredibly important because it is one of the only prisons, it is one of the only plantations in the country, and certainly the only plantation in Louisiana that singularly dedicates its sort of museum experience to, and its curatorial experience to reflecting what slavery was like for enslaved people. And this is important because it's surrounded by a constellation of plantations where people continue to hold weddings, where people to continue to hold parties and big events and debutante balls. And I was talking to some wedding planners during my reporting, and one of them told me about how at some of these places in Louisiana and in other states throughout the South, some people will use the former slave cabins as bridal suites as part of their wedding. So there's a sort of nostalgic, gone with the wind sort of sensibility or desire to grasp on to a past that for so many never was, and to tell a distorted story of what that past was. So I say all that because the Whitney exists as a sort of foil to that, as a counter to that. It's a space that says we cannot understand a plantation as anything other than an intergenerational site of torture and exploitation. And so one of the things that they do is they have the original slave cabin, right, from the 19th century that was there. And I remember standing inside this cabin, and you're standing there and you hear the way the wood moans under your feet when you walk. You see the way that there are cracks of in the roof and in the walls, and you imagine how susceptible these families would have been to the elements. You can smell the wet wood. It had just rained. You can smell the wet wood. There are snakes who are sort of coming out of the grass. You think about how susceptible that so many of those things people would have been. And similarly, you think about the families who lived in these spaces. And for me, slavery was one of those things that for so long I thought largely about in the context of the sort of spectacle of cruelty, the sort of, a very sort of heteropatriarchal, sort of masculinized version of the violence that slavery inflicted on people. And, we, in part because that is what is most famously depicted. We think of the famous scene in Roots, for example, when Kunta Kinte is being beaten and told to say his name is Toby. It's etched into so many of our collective consciousness. And to be sure, that is a huge part of what slavery was. But I didn't think about the totality of the institution's violence and the sort of quieter violences that emerged until I was standing in the slave cabin. And I closed my eyes, and I have two young children who at the time when I was writing the book were very young, 3 and 2, and had just been born. And I closed my eyes and I just imagined what it would be like if I went to sleep in my home and I woke up and my children were gone. And I had no idea where they were. I had no idea who had taken them. I had no idea if I would ever see them again. It's unfathomable to imagine that might happen. And then you have this moment when you're in this cabin, you think of the families, you see the cots and you see the small cradles and you recognize the families who lived here. And you have this moment where you realize that for millions of enslaved people across generations, across hundreds of years, this was an omnipresent threat that hung over you at every single moment of your life. And I think about the sort of psychological and emotional paralysis that might inflict, that at any moment you could be taken away from the people you love most, from your husband, your wife, your children, your father, your mother, your neighbors, and I think that for me, I bring it back to your original point, I get such a visceral sense of that from putting my body in the place where it happened, whether it be Whitney, whether it be Angola, whether it be, New York City, whether it be Galveston, all of these different places. Putting my body in the place where history happened gives you a more dynamic, and I think visceral sense of what the stakes were.
Yeah, yeah. So I want to talk about some of the other places that you went and that you chronicle in the book. But before we get to that, I want to talk about the reaction to this kind of, I guess, unveiling, right? Some of the places that you're writing about are places that most Americans have great reverence for. Monticello, of course, is the one that I think sticks out the most. Most people think of Thomas Jefferson as, the author of the Declaration. Some people know he was the founder of the University of Virginia and all kinds of other important milestones in our country's history. And they might know a little bit about the idea that he was a slave owner, or they might have heard of Sally Hemings or the Hemings family. But the way in which you characterize Monticello and its place in history, I don't know, it's kind of a splash of cold water on a lot of those ideas or myths, you might call them. So I wonder what some of the reaction has been, for instance, to that kind of narrative, that the things that in some cases we're taught as Americans to try to hold sacred or have incredible respect for are the very places that help prop up slavery, and to this day have propped up this incredible system of intergenerational inequality.
Certainly, I think there are a range of responses, right? Certainly, a lot of people come to a book like this or a subject matter like this carrying a lot of different experiences, a lot of different ideas. I love that line from the poet Alfred Lord Tennyson in his poem Ulysses, where he says, "I am a part of all that I have met," which is a beautiful yet simple way of saying that who each of us are this sort of remarkable amalgamations of the different facets of our identity, but also all the books we've ever read, all the movies we've ever seen, all the conversations we've ever had, all the people we've ever met, all the places we have ever lived. And so everybody brings their own unique set of sensibilities to a book like this. And so as a result, you get a range of different experiences. But what I'll say is that I've been very heartened by the vast majority of the responses, because, part of what felt important to me was to think about and tackle and present this history in a way that wasn't interested in shaming or haranguing or tirading people for things that they don't know. But to be a text that in some ways acted as an invitation toward curiosity, toward empathy, toward things that may be uncomfortable, but also things that make our lives and our sense of ourselves within the context of the world and within the context of this country give us a richer sense of ourselves. And I tried to model it after so many of the docents and tour guides and descendants who I spent time with. So part of what they do is there's like a both-handedness to their approach. So when you show up at Monticello and you're on David's tour, when you show up at Whitney and you're on Yvonne's tour, when you show up at Angola with Norris, or when you go to New York City with Damaris, part of what they do is there is an extension of grace and generosity, which is to say that they're not going to judge you for what you don't know. They're not going to shame you for what you don't know when you show up there, because they recognize that we are all part of a country in which there's been an institutional failing in our education system about how this part of our history is communicated and taught. But as much as there is grace and generosity, there's also the expectation of accountability and responsibility, which is to say that once this information is presented to you, whether it be about Thomas Jefferson, whether it be about New York City, whether it be about the Confederacy, whether it be about things that might run counter to the stories you've been told, even by the people you love, the people you trust, the people you know best, there is the expectation that you're going to sit with that, grapple with that. And even and it might be jarring, might be deeply uncomfortable, but there's a sort of mutual contract that exists in these spaces. And I think, and this goes back to what we were talking about before, I think there's something that happens in these spaces, in these sort of micro communities that are created there, that allow for the existence of such a mutual contract or understanding to form. Which isn't to say that people don't push back. You know, if you read the book, there are folks who go to Monticello and fundamentally reject the idea that he is the father of Sally Hemings' children, or that he ever owned enslaved people, even though all of the primary source evidence we have makes it very clear that he is. If you go to some places, like one of the places I went was the Blandford Cemetery, spent the day with members of the Sons Confederate Veterans for their Memorial Day celebration. And there you will hear lost cause propaganda everywhere. You will hear people say explicitly that the war was not fought over slavery, that secession didn't happen because of slavery. Even though if you read the declarations of Confederate secession that the states themselves wrote in 1861, they say explicitly, for example, Mississippi says, our position is thoroughly identified with the institution of slavery, the greatest material interest in the world. So they're not vague about why they're seceding, they're quite clear about it. But what happens is that for some people, if they have to accept a new story about this country, it means they have to accept a new story about themselves. Because for so many people, there's the story they tell about themselves, the story who they understand themselves to be, is deeply entangled in the sort of mythos of America, right? The sort of two-dimensional rendering of America that doesn't grapple with the totality of its legacy, that doesn't grapple with the way that different groups of people, different demographics of people experience certain events in fundamentally different ways. And so, you know, I think we're in a moment now where space is opened up, where people are telling a richer, more vibrant, more dynamic, more honest story of America across the country. And I think a large part of that is owed to the Black Lives Matter movement for the past 10 years that has opened up space for this sort of conversation to happen in our public discourse. But as we also see, when there are moments of progress in our political discourse, in our public discourse around things like history, there's also immense pushback from people who feel threatened by it, from people who feel not only threatened, but feel like an existential sense of fear from it. And so I think, you know, it's on us to make sure that we don't allow other people's fear to dictate the story we tell about who we are and who we've been.
Yeah. This is PBS Books. I'm Stephen Henderson, and I'm talking with Clint Smith, who is the author of How the Word is Passed. So Clint, I do want to talk about another place that you mention in the book, New York City. Not necessarily the first place that maybe jumps to people's minds when they think about slavery and the history of slavery, but of course, New York fits almost too well, I guess, into the narrative of our slave past. Talk about why that city is in the book.
You know, it felt really important to me to make sure that if I was going to tell a story about the history of slavery across America, obviously I can't go to every single place in America. You know, this book is written about 8 or 9 different places, depending on if you include the prologue and epilogue. But, you know, I could have written about 100,009 because the scars of slavery are etched into the landscape of this country everywhere. And it felt important for me to make sure that I wasn't presenting slavery as something that only existed in the South. That I wasn't presenting slavery as something that only the South even benefited from. Slavery, one, it existed everywhere at different periods of the American story. But also there are institutions across the country that benefited from the existence of slavery, even when the institution of slavery did not necessarily exist in that geographic space. And New York City is a prime example of that. So, you know, as I mentioned before, New York, to disabuse people who might not believe so, was at one point the second largest slave market in the country, right? After Charleston, South Carolina, and at a different point, New Orleans, Louisiana. And, you know, so there were many enslaved people who made their way through New York. It was one of the busiest ports of slave trading in the country in the sort of earliest days of the American experiment. But also as the experiment became more centrally, as the institution of slavery became more centrally located and more singularly located in the South in the 18th and 19th century, there were banks and insurance companies and all sort of financial institutions that benefited greatly from the existence of the slaveocracy of the South. So much so that in 1861, the mayor of New York City, Fernando Wood, proposed that New York City secede from the Union alongside the states in the South because their financial, social, and political interests were so deeply entrenched in the existence of slavery that if slavery was going to no longer exist, it would represent an existential threat to so many of the biggest players in New York City. And so, I go to a range of different places, some burial grounds, some places in Central Park that have a relationship to this history, including the Statue of Liberty, which many people don't realize was originally built and conceived of as an idea to be given to America by the French constitutionalist and expert on the American Constitution and abolitionist, Edouard de la Boulaye. And it was originally conceived of as something that would celebrate the end of slavery after the end of the Civil War. So it was a gift that was going to be given to the United States at the end of slavery. So much so that the original design, if you go to the museum on Liberty Island, they've done a great job of outlining this. The original design of the Statue of Liberty actually had chains, a broken pair of chains in her hands rather than the tablet. And there was so much pushback to that eventually they moved the chains down to her feet and put the tablet in her hand. But what happened is that if you go to the Statue of Liberty and you're standing next to it, one, it's massive, and you can't see the chains when you are standing next to it. You can only see it from like a helicopter or a plane or some sort of aerial view, and they're very subtle. These aren't big chains that are wrapped around her legs. They're sort of a small set of slinking chains that emerge from under her robe. And I think it's this really incredible metaphor for how sometimes the history of slavery is right next to you, even in ways that you don't necessarily realize.
Yeah. I also want to talk about your inclusion in this book of the island just off Senegal, which was the origin for so much of American slavery, the place that so many people passed through on their way to ships to be sent to America. It's not a part of America. It's not necessarily directly connected with American slavery, the experience that slaves had once they were here. But it's a crucial part of the story in the sense that, again, place matters. The souls who went through that place still occupy it in a really important and visceral way, I think. And I think you do a really wonderful job in the book of conveying that we can't talk about what happened here to Africans without talking about their leaving Africa in the first place.
Yeah, that was one of the last places that I went for the project, and I think I realized that I needed to go there in part because I had spent so much time at these domestic iterations of the slave trade. I spent so much time at plantations and all. There are all sorts of places I also went that weren't included in the book, that I went for further research, that I went for background, or that I went to sort of get a better sense of the different again, sort of manifestations of what slavery looked like in different places. But the more time I spent in these domestic arenas, the more I wanted to get a sense of how the story of slavery was told from its origin point, which is to say, enslaved people were taken from the coast of Africa, and sometimes even the interior of Africa in different ways, and brought across the ocean and brought to North America, South America, Europe for some time. And part of what I wanted to do was get a sense of, well, how is the story of slavery told in the place where it began? And so I wanted to get, how are Senegalese children told about this thing that happened here? How much is it similar to, or how much is it different than the story of slavery that exists here in the United States to the extent that it does? And I think it was also a really important thing for me to try to figure out how institutions and how these museum spaces tell the story of themselves. Because it can be a little tricky. I went to Senegal. I went to this Gorée Island, off the coast of Dakar, Senegal, in 2009 when I studied abroad in college. And I remember having this really powerful moment when I was standing in what's called the Door of No Return. And the sort of story of it is that this is the last door, the last piece of the continent that enslaved people, the captured Africans, touched before they walked the plank onto the ship and were sent across the ocean. What has been revealed in the last few years is that was not necessarily the door through which people exited. What has been revealed is that it wasn't millions of enslaved people who were held and eventually sent from Gorée Island, because that's the story that was told about it. That this was the place where the vast majority of captured Africans were held before they were sent off, being one of the furthest, most western points of the continent. It turns out that there wasn't millions and millions of people who shipped it from there. It was maybe closer to 30,000. And to be sure, that's still a lot of people, but it's a very different story than that which has been told about it before. So part of what I'm trying to do is even grapple with to what extent a place exists as a symbol of a larger history, even when they get some of the empirics wrong. And how does colonialism and the history of colonialism and the fact that Senegal wasn't a free nation until the 60s shaped its ability to have the documents and have the archives that allow it to even attempt to tell an accurate story of itself in the first place. And so what sort of stories get told about a place like Gorée to make sense of what happened there? And, just thinking about the sort of nuances of how slavery and colonialism and myth making and symbolism sort of become interwoven with one another and make it so that a place like that is moving through the process of figuring out how to tell the best version of the story of itself, which is something that, many places in the United States are still grappling with. In Monticello, for example, only instituted a Sally Hemings exhibit in 2018, I believe. For the vast majority of their existence, they didn't have a tour that mentioned slavery at Monticello. And so that's been a project that, even though that place existed for more than a century, it is only in the past sort of 20, 25 years that they have even begun to accept that slavery is part of the story they should tell about themselves. So all of these places, and that goes back to what I'm saying, all of these places some places are purposefully running away from the story. Some places are running head on toward the story. And a lot of places are somewhere in between, trying to do it, but doing it in a messy way, trying to do it, but doing it maybe inaccurately. And so, I'm as someone who is fascinated with and in love with public history and how spaces and the people in these spaces tell the story of what happened there. I think it's really fascinating to recognize the different gradations of how history emerges in these spaces.
So we're having this argument right now in this country about a lot of these narratives and whether to talk about them more, how to think about them, and I guess how to incorporate them into the way that we interact with each other right now. But the place that I'm, I guess, most intrigued by it is in the context of education itself. This fight about how important these stories that you're telling in this book and many other stories are to American children growing up understanding the truth about who they are and what this country is and where it comes from. I wonder what you make of that argument and especially of the position that this doesn't have a prominent place or shouldn't have a prominent place in the way that we teach history, the way what we teach about America and Americanism to our children. I imagine you have to be watching this with a really different perspective because of the work that you had to do to produce this book.
Yeah, I think often about this James Baldwin essay from 1964 called A Talk to Teachers. Mm-hmm. And in it, one of the things that Baldwin says, among many other things, is that he says the role of the teacher is to help the Black child understand that even though the world tells them they are criminal, the role of the teacher is to help that child understand that it is not the child who is criminal, but it is the society and the history that created the conditions that that child is forced to grow up in. That is the real criminal. And for many of us, that might seem intuitive, but I think we can forget how unintuitive it is to so many people, and how unintuitive it is to children who might not have otherwise been given the language or the tools or the history to make sense of why the world looks the way that it does. I remember for myself, part of the reason this book exists is because I remember growing up as a kid in New Orleans, Louisiana, being inundated with messages about all the things that were wrong with this majority Black city. That New Orleans was the murder capital of the nation. It was the prison capital of the world. It was a place that incarcerated more people per capita than China, Iran, and Russia. The public housing projects were representative of the social decay of the community. And so sometimes it would be implicit. People wouldn't say specifically racist things, but sometimes it was explicit, and people would say, this is what's wrong with Black people. And it felt like I was inundated with messages about all the things that were wrong with Black people. And no one ever gave me the information with which to make sense of the conditions that so many folks in my community found themselves in. Like, why was it that our community was disproportionately plagued with violence and poverty? And if you're a child and you're not given the language, or you're not given the history to understand the history of housing discrimination, to understand the history of redlining, to understand the history of mass criminality and mass incarceration, to understand the history of the way that our highways were built, to understand the history of slavery, understand the specific dimensions of the history of Jim Crow segregation. If people aren't telling you that, then part of what happens is that you look around and you fall into the trap of thinking that the reason one community looks one way and another community looks another way is simply because of the people in those communities, and not because of what has been done to those communities, generation after generation after generation. And I think it wasn't until adulthood, and in many ways, it wasn't until I began working on this book, I felt like I gained the language, I gained the understanding to more accurately make sense of why this country looks the way that it does. I think there's something so powerful about giving young people the tools to make sense of the country around them. Because we sometimes in education, we fall into this thing of like, especially telling like young Black and brown kids, you got to work hard, you got to push through, you got to overcome, you got to have grit. And I'm fine with those things on face level, right? Like it's important to work hard, it's important to have grit, it's important to overcome. But if that's the only message that young Black and brown kids are getting, and you're only telling them to overcome, but you're not telling them what they have to overcome, you're not telling them about the decades of public policy and legislation and judicial decisions that created the conditions that their communities are forced to navigate, then they begin thinking that they have to overcome something about themselves or something about their community that's inherent to them, rather than overcoming the things that were created, the conditions that were created in those communities because of decisions made by people in power. And so those things matter. And I remember when I began to learn these things, it was so liberating, it was so freeing, it was so emancipatory, because you realized that this country couldn't lie to you anymore. And there's so much power in that. And I think that also goes back to what we were talking about before. I think that's a lot of what people fear, right? They fear the idea that we would be able to see the faults in the American project. The idea that we would recognize it as imperfect, and a place that has provided, millions of people across generations with opportunities that their ancestors could have never imagined, but that is also done so at the direct expense of millions and millions of other people who have been intergenerationally subjugated and oppressed. And the truth is that America is both of those things. And in order to understand America, we have to be able to hold both of those things at once.
Yeah. Okay, Clint Smith, your book is really incisive and important, and such a great read. Thank you so much for producing it, but also thanks for joining us here on PBS Books.
Thank you so much for having me. It was great to talk to you again.
Yeah. Heather, back to you.
Well, thank you so much, Stephen, for all of those insightful questions, for moderating the conversation. And Clint, thank you for your work and for taking us through insights into your work and your personal experiences as a New Yorker. I really appreciated that New York was included because I think people from the North often forget, right? The North often forget. I also, as someone who studied public policy in school, really appreciate that you brought the historical perspective back to the policies of the last 100 years, even for people to better understand, because I think sometimes the last 100 years is often overlooked in history, or the last 50 years, because it's in June or it's in May, and the history teacher is just trying to get through the material and they don't go into those policies. And so the importance of your book and in explaining the nuances and all of that. So Clint, thank you for your work. This has been a wonderful conversation. For all of you in the DMV area, don't forget to go see Clint Smith at the Library of Congress National Book Festival. So this is the thing. The Library of Congress National Book Festival, September 3rd. It is one day. It is all day. It is a day that you want to be in Washington, D.C. Yes, there will be hundreds of thousands of people there, but you can plan your trip. You can make a determination and curate your own experience at the convention center, what you will see. And you will definitely want to see Clint Smith and hear more insights from him. You can see your favorite author and meet and listen to your next favorite author, discover new genres. It's just a great way to be able to have a great experience. But if you're not in the DC area, you can stream from the 3 stages, loc.gov/bookfest, leading up to the 2022 Library of Congress National Book Festival. PBS Books, in collaboration with PBS stations across the country and the Library of Congress National Book Festival, has 10 conversations that we've been doing. And it is our pleasure to share all of those with you so that you can learn more in your community online about this festival. So don't miss it. And don't forget to join us tomorrow evening. We will be interviewing Danielle Clayton with San Diego. And instead of at 8, it will be at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard. So don't miss it. Be there. Until tomorrow, I'm Heather Marie Montilla, and you're watching PBS Books. Happy reading.